You're listening to dialectradio.co.uk, your local community radio run by volunteers. Log on to our website at dialectradio.co.uk to find out more.
And I'm joined now by Jay Dyer, speaking from the US. Whereabouts are you, Jay?
I'm in the southern US, right around Nashville.
Tell us a bit about your background, because you've got actually quite I think, fairly spectacular blog where you go into a lot of the, I suppose, psychology of mass media. What's your background?
Well, I did a BA, a Bachelor's of Arts in philosophy, and then I studied history as well.
Whereabouts?
This is Murray State University, which is actually in Kentucky in the South. I did my graduate work was English and philosophy, and so my thesis work was dealing with the character of Ian Fleming and how he used James Bond as sort of a means not just of telling stories, but also of propaganda. So I talk about semiotics, which is the philosophy of signs and symbols, and how Fleming actually crafted Bond as a multi-tiered, multi-layered usage of propaganda.
Well, many of us, of course, are familiar with the Bond films, particularly here in Britain. What would you say, we ought to know that maybe we don't about Bond?
Well, what most people probably don't know is that the majority of Ian Fleming's stories and works are based on roughly, loosely real covert operations, or in some sense or some fashion, something relating to, say, the black market or something like that, would say Diamonds Are Forever, or to Malthusian policies of population reduction in something like Moonraker. These are all, of course, real things. And even though the films at times differ from the novels, of course, Fleming continued, to work with Saltzman and Broccoli, the producers, for many years, even after the last Fleming story. So what you have there, I think, is a situation of a direct tie between high-level naval psyops, which I don't know about in the UK, but certainly most people in the US are not aware of, Ian Fleming being someone who was involved directly in the special operations executive and things like this, which were high-level covert operations, black operations that were designed at the behest of Western intelligence. So everything from Operation GoldenEye and things like this that we're dealing with spying on Frankists in Spain up into the Cold War era with essentially designing propaganda. So you have this direct tie into Hollywood through characters like Noel Coward or Ian Fleming or Roald Dahl. They're all sort of running in the same circles. And, of course, as you mentioned before the show, Dennis Wheatley. Dennis Wheatley was also in those same circles, and this is where we have the tie-in to figures like Aleister Crowley being an MI5 asset and things like that. So a lot of those deeper, darker secrets, I think, are probably not known to the public.
Do you think there was, in some way, that Fleming was trying to tell the public something he couldn't officially tell people because of the Official Secrets Act?
I think so. And, of course, this is something spies have done for a long time. You have the secret agent, Joseph Conrad. What you can't say, in fact, you might get away with in fiction. And so this is a long-standing tradition of people writing reality into spy novels. So I have no doubt that, Fleming, what I read from the biographies that deal with him, like Andrew Lycett and others, is that, I don't think he was a bad guy at all. So I don't think he was intentionally trying to deceive people, but he was certainly sincere in, what he thought was the best policy for, the British Empire and so forth.
One of the tricks which is often played by intelligence agencies is they actually get people, maybe Fleming even included in this, to do what seem like covert operations for a good purpose. But once the operation's completed, slowly people realise, actually, this has actually been for a malevolent purpose behind this. And also, you mentioned Dennis Wheatley there. Yes, I mean, he was very much involved as a deception planner in the Second World War, even though he was a novelist in the run-up to it. And he's on the record as saying that much of what he was writing about after World War II was really based on his experience. I wonder, but you mentioned Crowley there. I mean, Crowley is another thing altogether. Well, he may be. I'm not sure. You tell me, because he's really seen as the sort of the Antichrist, the 666, this guy who was the most proud to be the most evil man on the planet. How does he fit in?
Well, the idea was that at the time of, as the war was coming to a close, World War II, the idea was, could we in some way create a ruse that might lure Rudolf Hess to come to Scotland? And so this involved Dennis Wheatley, Maxwell Knight, and of course Maxwell Knight is, according to Anthony Masters' thesis in his book, is the basis for the character M. So when you see James Bond getting his orders from M, that's based on Maxwell Knight. And so Wheatley and Knight and Fleming hatched this idea to, maybe utilize Crowley and his skills as a prognosticator. And there's an actual letter from Crowley to the NID, the Special Operations Executive, and the NID, to where he offers up his services. He says, if it's true that Hess is influenced by astrology and magic, my services might be of use to the department. I have the honor to be, sir, your obedient servant, Aleister Crowley. So, as to how far this scheme went, I'm not exactly sure. There's a lot of speculation. Many writers have written on this. Richard Spence, Craig Cobble, have dealt with it at length, but the details are still somewhat fuzzy, I guess. So
there's another thing in the background of Hess, which is the figure of Martin Bormann, because Hess and Bormann had similar sort of roles as assistants, very close to Hitler, although Bormann was much more involved as a treasurer, looking after the money side of things, and they were rivals to a certain extent. And the flight of Hess in 1941 to Britain was rather convenient for Bormann.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the notion of predictive programming. Peter Fleming, Ian Fleming's brother, who also wrote Pulp Fiction, wrote a book called The Flying Visit, and this was penned before Hess's flight. And in the story The Flying Visit, it's actually, I think, Hitler who flies over to England to negotiate a truce. So, was this predictive programming? Was this, an actual laying out of a plan? I don't know, but it's interesting nevertheless. But I think that, that's kind of how psychological warfare works. If you profile the person and they have a certain affinity or weakness or proclivity for something like astrology, you could see how that might be useful in luring them into something like, flying to Scotland for a truce.
Interesting as well that there were actually quite a lot of fascists in Britain. I mean, I'm not saying they're not still, there are, but people who were very sympathetic to the Nazi regime, and that was quite a strong faction that, for example, had kept Winston Churchill off the BBC during most of the 1930s.
Well, some people even mention the possibility of covert support from the British, and we know about support from American industrialists like Henry Ford. He wrote a whole treatise on this, supporting Hitler and fascism. So, there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest support from certain lords and British elite for Hitler and fascism. Absolutely.
Just getting back to Wheatley briefly, because he actually wrote a lot about black magic in his. He was well known really for writing a book which was made into a film called The Devil Rides Out, which was talked of as the greatest occult novel of the 20th century. I mean, how close do you think novels like that come to the reality behind these cults that Crowley was so involved in? Because Dennis Wheatley did meet Crowley, I think, several times and sort of wined and dined him to get material for his books.
Absolutely. The rumor is, according to Anthony Masters' book, that actually Maxwell Knight and Wheatley were inducted in some sense or initiated in some sense by Crowley. So certainly Wheatley took Crowley's esoteric knowledge serious. I don't know how far Wheatley himself took, practicing the occult, but I think that what you see in the novel, might be hyped up a little bit, with Duc de Richelieu, sort of performing a counter magical exorcism of some sorts. That might be hyped up a bit, but the general outline of what's going on here is very accurate.
You said mentioned predictive programming as well there. What is this? I mean, because you write about it a lot on your blog, which is jaysanalysis.com. So what is predictive programming? This is, I suppose, something which is we've mentioned briefly there, but it seems to be possibly much more prevalent today in our mainstream media.
Well, there's a lot of speculation online about this, but I think the best approach, if you really wanted to get a handle on it, would be to look at something like psychological warfare, or to look at the idea of white, black, and gray propaganda. And of course, these are long known techniques of maybe omitting something and putting out information to get a certain reaction, or mixing something true with a lot of falsehood to sort of bend the narrative in a certain direction.
So, what's the difference between the white, the black, and the grey?
Well, the white would be the omission, right? So if I put out something true, but I left out certain details, maybe to cover up who might be involved, and that might be an example of white propaganda. Gray propaganda would be mixing truth with falsehood, like I said, to sort of steer the narrative. And we think about O'Reilly talking about the no spin zone. Well, O'Reilly's show is nothing but a spin zone, right? I mean, that's the whole show. So that might be a good example of that. And then with black propaganda, you would have the idea of outright deception. So perhaps giving the enemy false direction, or, for example, Fleming was involved in a plot to leave papers on a dead soldier that detailed false plans. Right, so the Germans then had a misconception as to what Allied plans were based on what they thought were secret plans that were found. So that would be an example of black propaganda. And so essentially what you're doing is just conditioning the thought process of the enemy or the target. And that's what films can do. So they can condition. And I think that's the central role of what we call predictive programming. If anyone wants like an academic treatise on this, there's a famous essay that was in the Journal of Semiotics. It can be found online, and it's called The Semiotics of Media Images from Independence Day and 9/11, 2001. So if you remember that cheesy alien invasion film that came out sometime in the 90s with Jeff Goldblum and I forget who, Will Smith, you'll recall that film is all about the destruction of large-scale national monuments, right? And this, I guess on a psychological level, sort of instills the fear of the external threat, right? And this is, the build-up to the in the U.S. at least, the Patriot Act after 9/11 and the war on terror and subsequent foreign invasions. And so this, Professor Elliot Gaines, who wrote this piece, summarizes that essentially what you have is a clear example of preparation for the created external threat of, bin Laden in Iraq, which was not true, right? We all know about the WMD lies, right? But it provided a pretext because the way propaganda and psychological warfare functions is merely to condition and cause a reaction, right? So shut off critical thinking and just bring about an emotional reaction. And so Bush can get on and say, we got to get the terrorists, we're going to go after Saddam, Iraq, right? Which there's no logical link between Saddam Hussein and his Ba'athist party and Al Qaeda, but regardless, that's the U.S. Shock and awe approach, right? So there's a scholarly example from that you can find that actually treats this notion of predict. Now, it may not use the term predictive programming, but that's what the professor is dealing with in that piece. And so you can expand from there, and what you start to notice is that, well, this is actually a long-term thing. This has been going on for a long time. The Department of Defense has long been involved in putting money into Hollywood films all the way back to the 20s and 30s, even before it was called the Department of Defense, back when it was the Department of War. They were involved in specifically having agents in place in Hollywood to make sure that messages that were put into film were crafted in a certain direction. And there have been, many books have been written on this. So the thesis is not one of merely conspiracy theorists, slapping away at keyboards online. It's an actual military tactic, I guess you could say, was the best way to look at it. And then it sort of spills over into mass media, into even mass music industry as well. All of these sort of are arms of this same full spectrum dominance approach. Now,
you're talking about the idea of the population, that's us, being targeted. And, it almost seems like we're the enemy. We're being targeted by the psychological warfare officers of the maybe perhaps different NATO countries. I noticed just recently, I think maybe 18 months or so ago, Chicksands in Bedfordshire is where the British psychological warfare people, the British Army, are trained, and there's a new organisation that was set up there called Brigade 77. Which immediately makes me think of the 7/7 London bombings. I don't know whether it's just a complete coincidence. But this bothers me when it looks like the mass media is a vehicle to target us, Jay.
Yes, that is the purpose of the mass media. In fact, I would say Hollywood, mass media, they're all kind of arms of the same octopus, and they are psychological warfare. That's what they... I mean, they have other functions as well, obviously monetary gain and promoting the careers of whoever, whatever, CEOs and so forth. But the primary goal, I think, is and the reason we know this is that you see a unified agenda across the presentation of most films, especially. And so for example, I mentioned, Independence Day. There's a documentary, Real Bad Arabs. This all throughout the 90s. Up into the early 2000s, you had the presentation of the Arab villain as essentially the only villain that's out there in the world, and this was building up to 9/11. Another film like Starship Troopers is treated in Professor Gaines's piece as tying into the writings of Brzezinski. So the Grand Chessboard came out a few years after Starship Troopers, and again, what do we have? Yes, it's dealing with aliens, and I'm not, the aliens are not the problem. The problem is the creation of the unconscious association of the external threat, right? And that's the point of how fiction can be used in psychological warfare. And this goes all the way back to The Twilight Zone. You can see the early episodes of The Twilight Zone in the credits. They'll talk about how they were created in consultation with the Department of Defense. And a lot of those Twilight Zone episodes dealt with specifically World War II and then Cold War propaganda. So the idea was, the Soviet threats, it's everywhere. Then that transitions into the war on terror. The external alien threat is just everywhere. They're going to get you. And so you're absolutely right that we're the target. And it goes much deeper than that and darker than that, unfortunately. We think about Michael Aquino, who's a psychological warfare expert in the Army. He's one of the highest specialists in the Army in regard to this, and he wrote a famous piece called Mind War and Psy War, From Mind War to Psy War, right, which deals with how the U.S. needs to transition out of psychological warfare into actually controlling the perception of the populace, not just targeting the populace for certain buildups to a war and maybe getting everyone on board, but actually a full spectrum controlling of perception, not just perception of war or politics, but of the entirety of one's worldview, of reality itself. So it's a very wide-ranging in scope, and it's subversive, and it is targeted at the population as a whole.
I mean, Brigade 77 in Chicksands in Bedfordshire in the British Army, they boast that they believe that it's possible to win a war with hardly a shot being fired. I just wonder if you think that they are almost psychologically warfaring, conning themselves. Is that really possible?
Well, I think that goes back to Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu said something to that same effect, that the real battle is won in the mind, not actually on the field. And if you can get your opponent to acquiesce without killing anybody, then that's even better than losing soldiers. So, yeah, I think that we're unfortunately approaching a kind of dystopian synthetic reality where everybody's so plugged into what they read in mainstream sources or see in mainstream television that you could conceivably, this is actually in the film Wag the Dog, right, where they create a whole war that's not real in the Balkans, at the behest of Robert De Niro playing Conrad Breen, the sort of private intelligence / CIA consultant who gets Dustin Hoffman playing this sort of director-producer figure in Hollywood to create a synthetic war. And how close is that to all the stuff that we've seen with like Syrian Danny and things like that? That, in my view, are provocations for situations in Syria or Western support and aid to things like ISIS.
Just before the death of Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, I was looking this up recently, and it's quite clear there was some kind of psychological operation going on there using social media, Facebook and Twitter, and things like that, actually in Libya itself. I mean, most people, I suppose, wouldn't have been able to read those languages in this part of the world, so probably wouldn't have been noticing. But just at the point where the kind of final showdown with Gaddafi and the so-called rebels, Al-Qaeda, effectively in Libya was happening, there was a massive campaign on social media put out, I imagine, by our psychological warfare people, saying he's lost, he's gone, and showing even pictures supposedly of Gaddafi being killed, the whole thing having been set up in a scene from a set over in Dubai, of all places. But this kind of wave of defeatism just before the crucial part where Gaddafi may have been able to I suppose, do something about the insurrection going on in his country, I think is a really good example of how these psychological warfare officers, they would say enhance. I mean, I wouldn't use that word, but, what the troops are doing on the ground. I just wondered, what you make of this military use of psychological warfare, Jay, because I know that there are big private corporations that will actually headhunt former Army psychological warfare officers, people who've been trained by us, by the military, by our taxes, and then tap them on the shoulder and say, actually, how would you like to quadruple your salary and come and work for us? We're talking about big companies like Strategic Communications, and these kinds of people that do, I suppose it's like public relations on steroids, to do with things like, we will win an election for you, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. This was also came out in mainstream news even at the time of the Arab Spring. Whatever one's perspective on the Arab Spring is, it was mainstream news that this was all done at the behest of Google. So this so-called revolution is engineered essentially by, I don't remember the name of the guy at the time, but whoever was the head of Google at the time was talking about it openly. So we helped the Arab Spring by promoting it through Twitter and Facebook. And so, nowadays that's a big part of psychological warfare, is the whole social media aspect of it. And the Pentagon has a big part to play in that. Social media itself is a creation of the intelligence agencies through In-Q-Tel, which is a private CIA company that puts money into things like Google and Facebook. So nothing new there. This has been going on since the beginning of social media. But you're absolutely right that the military is very much interested in this, and then of course what you do is you go from there to private contracting. So you move on to the private corporations, and this is why this kind of work has always been tied into advertising, because that's just essentially what you're doing. Psychological warfare is pretty much advertising. You want to convince the opponent or the target audience that you've got the goods, you've got be on our side. And that's exactly what advertising is. And so PR, same thing, political campaigns, working in political campaigns. And it all goes back to psychology. So you're absolutely right. And that is a huge problem in the modern world.
What about today? Because, one thing you could do potentially with predictive programming is to look at some of the films that are being on release at the moment and say, hang on a minute, this has got some kind of message in it that maybe the almost decode what the military are planning for our future by looking at some of the plot lines in Hollywood films.
Right. I think that's possible. If you get really skilled at it, you could conceivably do that. There's actually a movie that deals with that very idea, except it's with novels. Of course, if you remember the Robert Redford film 3 Days of the Condor, his job as an intelligence analyst was to simply read a bunch of books, read novels all day, and look for hidden communiques and possible plots and so forth that might be embedded, or messages that might be ciphers that might be embedded in literature. So conceivably, that could be done.
Have you tried it, Jay? Have you had a look at any films over the last, 6-8 months or year or so, and thought to yourself, well, I wonder if this is what the future holds for us?
But you I guess you risk a lot if you if you go out and say that you're going to predict the future. But
because that's in a way a flaw, isn't it? In this psychological warfare system, is that it might be that people get so smart that they're not watching films for their entertainment value. They're saying, well, actually, this is what our government is planning to do to us.
Yeah, but I don't think the establishment is too worried about too many people actually doing that. And a lot of times it's mixed in with gibberish and gobbledygook, like aliens and things like that. That kind of like you might have the conditioning towards, say, some sort of new technological move or development or something like that. The idea of, say, wearable technology that Bilderberg talked about recently, or microchips or RFID vitamins or something like this. You might have that, say, in the Bourne films, which the last Bourne film with Jeremy Renner included that idea. But, you've got all this other fictional stuff, the Hollywood stuff that's kind of packaged along with it that I think leaves most people with the notion that, that's fiction. That's... if you were to talk to somebody about the idea of swallowing an RFID vitamin, they would say, "Well, you're talking Philip K. Dick science fiction stuff. That's not reality." But this is the world that we're going into. Smart cities, right? We're going into this AI grid, and so I think that the mixing it with fiction and the Hollywood elements is what kind of gives it carte blanche. It sort of cloaks it, if you see what I'm saying.
What about, is there an antidote to this? I mean, is there any way to actually watch these films, still enjoy them?
The only antidote is to go to Jay's analysis and to subscribe to my site. I think we have to get back to critical thinking. Most of the public just receives. We're consumers. We're obsessed with consumerism, and we're the same way with information. We just consume it and entertainment. And essentially we live now in a period of infotainment where, the news and everything is all like Hollywood. It's all entertainment. And so that is all premised on not critically thinking. So I always tell people, if you want to start somewhere, I would say basic critical thinking, basic logic. If you learn, say, the basic logical fallacies, you're going to not fall for the majority of, say, advertising scams or propaganda that would be embedded in fictional presentations or in Hollywood.
But, if you start questioning everything, aren't you going to go crazy?
Well, maybe we need to go crazy. Maybe that's a good step in the right direction. We're already crazy, so we need to step out of being crazy.
Okay, Jay Dyer from jaysanalysis.com. Thanks very much for joining us on Dialect. That's all for this week. Dialects, Bristol's first weekly MP3 podcast, has been broadcast on community radio stations in Bristol, Swindon, Preston and St Albans. If you're online, you can subscribe to our emails or download the podcast from dialectradiooneword.co.uk. Thanks to our guests this week. That's Naya and Habakkuk, talking about St Paul's Carnival and the police. Ian Dumble, who's homeless, and talking also about his trouble with the police too, and his interest in aviation. Finally, Jay Dyer from Nashville, talking about predictive programming and psychological warfare. Thanks also to studio engineer Dave Bazanko. Dialect's a Bristol Broadband Co-op production, and anyone can contribute. Contact us through the People's Republic of Stokes Croft, just off Jamaica Street. Call them on 0117 909 6897 or visit them on the web at prsc.org.uk. That was Dialect, and I'm Tony Gosling, wishing you a very good week. Thanks for listening. Till the same time next week, goodbye for now.